Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Philosophical Friday. This is your co-host, Peter Bermingham, and yours truly, Duncan Palamourdas. How are you, Peter?
I'm very well, Duncan. Very well. Good to see you. Good to see you back home in your natural habitat, as it were, after a period of travel.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm excited, and I'm actually really excited too because we have a wonderful topic today, and the entire community is actually involved in it. So things are exciting. Like, we're going to reveal at the end some very interesting questions that people asked, some very interesting things they have to say. But before we get into all of this, what is the topic that we're going to talk about today?
So the topic for this week, Duncan, is superstitions. I think it's always a good one with poker players. You know, supposedly we don't believe in luck, and it's all, you know, all the variance, everything is naturally occurring. But I think deep down, every single one of us has some sort of superstition that we hold on to. So we're gonna dive into that today. We're gonna start off, do our usual. We're gonna start off by defining what we mean when we talk about superstitions and get into some examples. And then later on in the show, we've got some, as you said, we've got some very interesting questions from the village. So we're gonna try and answer them, and then we're gonna reveal some interesting and wacky superstitions that were fed to us through various channels. And I'm gonna throw this one out right now for the audience. So a relatively famous online cash player has a superstition that when they are on a downswing, they shave their facial hair in the hope that it improves their look.
That's awesome.
So start guessing, throw your guesses out there, and we will reveal the answer at the end of the show.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to whet your appetite even further, we're going to talk about our own quote-unquote superstitions. We will see how much they qualify and things like that. But let's jump right into it, right? I mean, we always talk about definitions, and today it's a doozy because finding a good definition of superstition is a challenge. And I would argue one of the biggest issue that we can find out there is that instead of describing the innate property of what superstition is, people describe epiphenomena, right? In other words, they're describing how people materialize superstition out in the world instead of what superstition is. An example would be, oh, what is gambling? Gambling is, roulette. Well, no. Roulette is a form of gambling, but gambling is not roulette. So when people say, people going to go to the casino and that's what gambling is, they're sort of missing the point. Similarly with superstition, they say things like, let's do a quick, it was very interesting. Like, if you do a Google right now, and I'm doing it live as we speak, we're doing live, a belief or practice resulting from ignorance, fear of the unknown, trust in magic or chance or false conception. I really do not like that definition. Or another definition.
That's a very negative definition. That's really kind of throwing it out there that if you have superstitions, you're not necessarily all there in the head. You've got a few screws loose.
Exactly. Any belief or practice, that's from Wikipedia, any belief or practice considered by non-practitioners to be irrational or supernatural, attributed to fate or magic. And I really don't think any of these definitions get into what it is. Let me just throw my version of definition, if you don't mind, and then you can tell me, your version, if you will, right? So the way I would define definition is the uninformed belief in a weak or non-existent causal link between action and consequence. What do I mean by that is that people think if I do X, the result is going to be a Y, right? I think, and what makes it a superstition instead of an educated guess is that there's a weak or non-existent causal link. Everything else, talking about fear, magic, supernatural, irrationality, all of these are epiphenomena, right? So, and I would, put out a second sentence, it is often supernatural and clairvoyant in nature and occasionally accompanied by rituals, which attempt to strengthen the aforementioned link, right? But it's a cause and effect situation, right? I'm wearing my red shirt because it's going to bring me luck. I'm avoiding the black cat because again, I'm gonna get avoid bad fortune. So it's usually I do A in order to get B, and then that causal or correlational relationship is typically pretty weak.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that that's how you define it, because I don't often spend a lot of time before the show thinking about how I would define a particular topic. It just kind of I like to let it kind of flow organically. But I actually put a little thought into this, and I was like, how would I define a superstition? Like what exactly? And almost identical to what you actually said. It was X occurs because I do Y, when X and Y bear almost no relation to each other.
That's right.
And may not even be in the same, sphere. That's
exactly correct. And it's actually very interesting because it's all about the causal link, right? Or the correlational link. It's all about the link. Is the link strong or not? And typically, if it's not strong, that's why we call it a superstition, right? But it's interesting. It is interesting because then it raises a lot of interesting questions. For example, here's a question. Are superstitions really irrational? Like really deeply, deeply irrational? Meaning, do they come from people who are not using logic? And I can be very specific. I can give you an example, right? Let's say that I ask you the following, I'm saying the following statement. The tree or the trees are made of demons, right? So demons live inside those trees. Demons will hurt me. I do not like to be hurt. Therefore, I should avoid sleeping under the tree. And here's my question. Is that a valid or invalid argument? In other words, does it logically imply the conclusion? Do the conclusions follow logically, rationally from the premises? And let me repeat what I just said, right? The trees are made of demons, or demons live in the trees. Demons will hurt me. I do not like to be hurt. Therefore, I should avoid sleeping under the tree. Am I rational or irrational? And then is this a valid or invalid argument?
Yeah, I think I do understand what you're actually saying. And yeah, I think this is a rational argument because it's based in logic, in your beliefs. And it's a logical flow through. There's no, like, you can say that the logic is flawed because whatever you believe about demons, but the process, the logic you have, because that's your belief, that is your logic flow and your process. So yeah, it's absolutely rational.
It's absolutely rational. And it's very important to say,
absolutely rational.
There is nothing wrong with the logic here. It's very important. What is wrong is with the truth of the assumption. So this is in logic, it's called a valid yet unsound statement. What it means is that it has a false conclusion, but the logic flows perfectly. So somebody who indeed believes that there are demons inside trees, they will make that conclusion if they are of a rational mind. I would make the same conclusion. If I start with the assumption, that there's demons inside the trees, I will make the same conclusion, which means it's not about irrationality, right? It is, as a matter of fact, it is about finding weak correlations or finding correlations where none exist. So it's basically our way, our pattern recognizing device gone wrong, essentially, right? It's essentially creating an unsound situation because our pattern recognizing or our proto-scientific, if you will, approach to things, our proto-rationality goes wrong because the data is insufficient, or we try to give an answer where none exists. This is what Taleb will call be fooled by randomness, but it's not just Taleb, it's everybody, right? I mean, when you try to see a pattern, if somebody puts a gun in your head and they tell you, here is a random generator, can you see a pattern? Of course you can find a pattern, right? But that pattern is just pure noise. So what are some types of superstition?
I think we have, I think there's like that. There are superstitions that are kind of personal to us, things that we do ourselves. Like
Right.
for a poker player example, you enter a tournament, day one, you run up a big stack. You're not changing your t-shirt till the tournament ends. Like that's
Right.
a form of a superstition. It's
Right.
you believe it's brought you luck, or for whatever reason, that's one form. I think there are more cultural superstitions, like people in general believe certain things. I think a really good example that's, I know it's widely held, it's not even specific to one country, is Friday the 13th. Like that's, like, I mean, that's pretty much a global thing. I think certainly in Western culture, that the fact that Friday the 13th is unlucky, and that's extremely broad.
Absolutely.
And then I think there are kind of funny ones that, this was one I was thinking of, because I have a particular one with this, where I have superstitions around my behavior that affect other people, i.e. my sports team. So, for example, one superstition that I have with my GAA Gaelic football team is that if I have not bought the new jersey for that season and worn it before the first game of the season, I cannot buy it and wear it during the season because it's bad luck.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. And it's actually interesting to try and find out, where that may be coming from, right? And it could be, I know a lot of people will think, well, that's completely random, but it's actually incredibly hard to be random. As a matter of fact, humans are terrible at being. We cannot be random, no matter how hard we try.
We don't do it well. I think that's been proved over and over again on this podcast and many others. We don't do randomness well.
We don't do randomness well. We don't respond to it very well, and we cannot generate it ourselves very well, right? I mean, if you tell somebody, create a random sequence of heads and tails, they will create some pattern. They just won't realize it. They will not let, for example, the tails come more than 3 times in a row, because what are the odds of that? But here's the interesting thing. Typically in things like that, and I think that's what separates the definition of the superstition that we get from the other definitions, is that that's not necessarily irrational if you think about it. It's just really bad data mining. What I mean by that is that perhaps, and of course I don't want to put words in your mouth or anything like that, but perhaps people who do have these types of behaviors, perhaps you did that once, you bought the jersey at some point and your team lost the championship or something like that. So by using the sample of one, you're creating some sort of like correlational pattern, which is, by the way, what humans do really, really well, picking up patterns. Now, the inferences might be bad, but the patterns that we're picking, they're out there. So you are doing something incredibly causal. You're responding to some data point. Whether or not your inference or your conclusion is what a proper science would do is a completely different story, but you are responding, and this is very relevant, you are responding to a trigger. So you are picking up a pattern. And that, let me give you another example. Do you know how Friday the 13th came about? I found that by doing research. I didn't know myself.
No, actually, I don't, believe it or not.
It's a combination of two things. The first one comes from, and I'm giving you like the most dominant theory, right? That there's several theories, as it is the case with typical things like that. So the first one comes from a religious influence, the famous Last Supper, where there were 13 people and all hell broke loose after that. So as you can see, that's a pattern. You have 13 people, something bad happens. So 13 means bad. It means bad in that one instance, of course. So it's like the bad statistics, but the relationship is there. That's rational. It's not good science, but it is proto-science in some sense, right? And that is something that, if we want to be honest about this type of things, instead of just finding, an answer that is like, oh, you know what, all the superstitious people are just stupid. Like, how, like, that's not a satisfying answer. Like, what is it that they're doing? What is it exactly? What is the disagreement compatibility? What is it that's happening inside the human brain that makes us mess up so many times, and why so many of us are doing it, even people who are like scientifically inclined. So there is more than just stupidity there. It is some sort of like useful mechanism that is being misapplied in a certain way. And I think that can be relevant. So why Friday? Why Friday? Did you know that in Europe, I didn't know that either. Did you know that in Europe, when they were doing the hanging back in the medieval ages, they will hang people on Friday. So it was a typical day of hanging. So and I don't know why I'm laughing here. I mean, I think it's just ridiculous. But if you were to be sentenced to death, Friday was the day. So now you have a double whammy of, the Last Supper, 13 people, all hell's going to break loose, and Friday, which is people again going to get hanged. So Friday 13th, it's literally all about death.
Wow. It's like, in fairness, it makes sense when you say it like that. And I think if you're to dig into a lot of superstitions, especially those sort of the bigger ones, the really sort of cultural ones, a lot of them do have their roots in religion. Yeah, right. In some form, whatever your particular belief system is. Right. But yeah, that's a really interesting. It's actually interesting that they hung people on a Friday. Like I've heard of the idea you put out bad news on a Friday because nobody reads newspapers over the weekend. I can't imagine that was the issue back in those days. But yeah, that's an interesting one.
And here's another sort of like speculation, right? So imagine that you live in a time where, there's a lot of death on Friday, right? And because there's a lot of death on Friday, I mean, it's logical, and I mean completely logical, not superstitious at all, to think that there's going to be a lot of negativity in the environment, right? Right? I would imagine that if there were people dying left and right, it couldn't be cause for celebration, right? Which means it would legitimately be a bad day to do things. Like everybody would be on their bad mood. And that's the type of thing that I call proto-science. There's typically some form of correlational aspect that is picked up by very, very sensitive brains, and it's just misapplied. But that's not irrationality. It is just bad data collecting, right? It's a different thing. It's not invalid. It's very much valid. Logic is still alive and kicking. What is not is sound. It's unsound but valid. And that's, I don't know, like I find that very, very, very interesting myself.
And that would kind of follow, because like that, if there is like that so much negativity around, like, I mean, if you arrive on Friday morning and it's like that, it's considered a day when a lot of people are going to die. There's a lot of negative energy, and that negative energy seeps out. Like it moves from one person to the next, and it can easily infect a population, for that particular day. The same way we get infected in a good mood over holiday periods, because everybody's in a good mood, and that sort of the joy spreads throughout most people. The same is true for sort of bad energy and negative emotions. So yeah, that does make it actually, but it makes a lot of sense. Again, it's very rational.
Absolutely. And after that, it sort of like propagates, right? Because again, if you do that over a period of years, then, mom and dad pass that to the kid passes to their kid. And incidentally, what is out of all, scientists have done research on that topic, actually, right? I mean, trying to find what types of personalities or what type of situations are the most likely to produce an environment where people are susceptible to develop superstition. Do you want to make a wild guess? What is number one on the list? Although the correlational aspect of it is not very high, and I will explain what that means later.
I have no idea.
It's certainly not genetic, so that's not number one on the list. So there's two things. Number one on the list is if you live in an environment where people are superstitious, you typically could be superstitious yourself. And then the second thing is that people who have anxiety in general tend to have more, they're more prone to superstition. And the reason for that is that part of the reason why superstitions exist, again, it is our need. That's why we use the pattern-based methodology that we have. It's our need to control the environment. And that's why
Yes.
we're using our patterns, right? What does it mean to control the environment? It means I want to understand what's happening. Like there is a lot of uncertainty here, but I want to see patterns. I need patterns because I don't know how to deal with randomness. I need patterns to exist. Where are my patterns? Let's create some. Let's find the best patterns possible. And the more anxiety we have, the less likely we are to feel comfortable in an uncertain environment, because that creates even more anxiety. Now, I said earlier, the correlation is very low. That means that the chances of somebody who has anxiety, if I tell you all else being equal, somebody's very anxious, are they superstitious? It only moves the needle by something like 10%, right? So this is what, for statisticians out there, the R squared is about 10%, which means about 10% of the variability can be explained through anxiety, which essentially means it's very, very, very weak correlation. Very weak correlation, anxiety and the environmental things.
But still a higher correlation than any other sort of environmental or situational factors.
Correct.
It's low, but it's the highest in a very low category is basically what you're saying.
Absolutely. 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 And what are some other examples? I mean, there is some really nice examples in coming from Asia. 8 is lucky because it sounds, when you pronounce it, like prosperity, I believe, and then 4, most people
unlucky because it sounds like a word for death.
That's correct. That's correct.
Again, never knew that 4 was unlucky, and never knew that that it was because it was related to death, which typically, from what I looked at, typically a lot of the Asian superstitions are very specific around death. There was one I saw where, in the presence of, at a funeral or in a graveyard, to tuck your thumbs into your fist, because the belief is that this protects your parents from death, is the superstition around that one, which I
interesting
found
I would be very interested in finding the roots of that. Like, like there must be some roots. And here's the interesting thing, right? I mean, the roots can be something completely ridiculous, and then you have the socially hereditary element of it, meaning, once for some ridiculous reason, that thing grows and it spreads into the population, then it's very easy to spread it into the descendants, right? So then we can understand why so many people are. But that's very, very interesting. Would you happen to know the origins of that one? The thumbs?
No, I didn't actually. I didn't actually get deep enough to find the origins of that one. Maybe I might look into that, and I'll throw an answer up into the village, into Greatness Village, in the coming days. If anyone wants to check that out.
Absolutely. And incidentally, this is probably as good time as any to let people know that moving forward, we sort of really liked your responses. So moving forward, we're going to be letting you know of the topic ahead of time, so you can throw some interesting questions, so for us to do a little bit of research and be involved in the topic. It's really nice, involving the community. So what else do we have? Is there any, we talked about the definition, we talked about types, we talked a little bit about the reasons, the need for control, order out of chaos, and also sometimes it's low cost. It doesn't really cost to have like a wacky sort of belief about things. And also sometimes you simply get.
I sometimes think the factor that sometimes gets applied to people who may not be religious, but in situations they will pray. What's the harm? It can only be plus EV to do this thing. There's be no negative aspect to this at all. So I'm just going to throw it in there as a bit of extra protection or extra good luck if it's possible.
That's right. The so-called non-negative EV, right? I mean, it can never be negative. So Pascal's wager, right? I mean, what can go wrong? I might as well take a shot of it. But speaking of which, when do you think are some situations where superstitions can be dangerous? Because it's not all fun and games, right? Some of the things can actually be detrimental to our being.
That's an interesting one. And I think sometimes when we, and I listen, I don't want to sort of drag us off topic too much, but I think, and this is getting back to, this is actually, it was interesting. I saw this meme earlier, and it kind of got me thinking, even though it was meant as a joke, but it kind of does make sense that religion and superstitions are the same thing with just different spellings. That now, again, a big asterisk beside this one. I do not think religions are all based in superstitions, but some of the there are similarities, shall we say?
That's right. Yeah. No.
So yeah. So I think from a dangerous point of view, sometimes is when we probably take these things too far. Because taking anything too far, taking anything to an extreme is going to be dangerous. So yeah, that's probably the one thing that I could see. I'm sure you have something in mind, Duncan, that I just haven't thought of. Maybe you might enlighten us a little.
Oh, sure. No. I mean, again, doing some research, finding some examples. But you said something very interesting that I wanna touch on a little bit, because the idea of superstitions and religion, and I don't necessarily think that it is that religions have stronger underlying principles or anything like that. I mean, I don't think that's where the similarity is. I think that the similarity, the difference comes from the fact that the reason why religions have survived for so long is because of how people act, not how people think, right? Because in most situations, to this day, I don't know what people really believe. I ask a different person of the same belief system, and I typically get a different answer. So I have no idea what really happens inside their minds. But one thing that we can tell is how people act, and the rituals and the processes, and all of these things is what makes and breaks certain situations. And as a matter of fact, it is documented that both rituals and faith can potentially be helpful. But like with everything, there's bad rituals and there's bad faith. So if the faith, helps people to actually create communities, be helpful to one another, gather together, love each other, protect each other, that can be helpful. But if, the rituals make people, explode themselves, go into crusades or whatever it may be, that's a different story. So I think ultimately the decision is not in truth. It's not if religion is true or not. And it's not if the superstition is true or not. In the end of the day, is about, I would say, usefulness. And I think you nailed it. And usefulness as it is derived from the actual doing it, from the actual process, right? So
it is, and you're right. It's all about the practice, the act of going to church, the praying, the various, and depending on what your culture is, or your particular religion, and the various rituals that you have, it's all in those acts, and that's the basis for what I was getting at. Exactly
right, and it's the praying, not who you're praying to. This is very important. It's the praying, not who you're praying to, because again, that could explain why people who are non-believers, they pray. It's not because they ask for the help. It's all the emotional responses that in the end of the day matter, right? I think that's actually a very important distinction, right? The idea that it's not what people think or believe, that's secondary. It's how they act. It's not what you say, it's what you do, right, in the end of the day. And as we will see, I think it's relevant to poker. But there's two examples, I think, which are very, very relevant. And these two examples are obviously gambling, excessive gambling, right? And in my definition, that would be the version of negative EV gambling, right? Sometimes people say, you know what, I'm on a up streak right now. If I stay a little bit more, I can win in roulette or whatever it is. And that, or today is, Friday the 13th, I shouldn't go at the poker table, and that, could hurt an otherwise, profitable day.
Or quite a common one with gambling, Duncan, is very much associated with horse racing or even dog racing.
Right.
Somebody's oh my, look at the name of that horse.
Right.
That it's a sign, like it might be their child's name, some
Right.
variation of their wife's name, or it speaks to them. And all of a sudden, that's a sign I must bet money on this. Now, most people that do that will have a small flutter. It'll be an inconsequential amount of money that they're happy to lose, and it's no harm. It's just a bit of fun. But as you say, people take it to extremes. Somebody with a propensity or a serious addiction may see this as a sign to get out of the hole as such, and all of a sudden a massive wager goes on. That's a huge problem.
That's a huge problem. Indeed, exactly. Anything that goes to extreme levels, and it's no longer low cost, because we said, superstitions can be low cost. And who knows, maybe you picked up a pattern that nobody else has. That sometimes happens too. Maybe black cats had a virus that, we didn't know about. And, who knows, right? And I'm not saying that this is likely, by the way. For the scientifically minded out there, I want you to, make sure that, you understand the argument here. My argument is not that we should take superstitions seriously. My argument is that they come from a well-intended mechanism that is misapplied, right? So, and that misapplication sometimes, could, because again, it's a well-intended, well-functioning mechanism, can actually pick up important patterns from time to time. So rarely, but we can. And of course, the other thing that comes to mind is alternative medicine. I know a lot of people are, and when I'm talking about alternative medicine, there are some things that, scientifically, not only they don't help, but they could make a situation worse. There's situations of people, like having cancer and then taking, some sort of like an alternative medicine and then, getting worse, or situations like this. I'm not saying that, chemotherapy could be better with all of the toxicity, but, there's a difference between the evidence is different, right? I mean, on the one hand, we have a situation where some of the brightest minds of humanity have worked on the specific topic for years, and on the other hand, we have somebody who's basically giving you water, right? And to be fair, if we want to be fair in all of these things, sometimes there's psychological aspects, the so-called placebo effect, that can actually have beneficial properties. And famously, Taleb has said that part of the reason, that's one of the things that I disagree with him, but one of the reasons why people survived with religion is that during the 1800s, the doctors would do more bad than good. So just by praying, you actually stayed out of the doctor's, out of the butcher's office, not the doctor's office.
So it actually probably had some basis in data at that stage, because the results were actually better. Whether the causal effect was necessarily the case, but it was the results certainly skewed in that direction.
Right. So one has to be careful. And I mean, things like that can happen. But for the most part, I mean, it all comes down to evidence, right? And the evidence is just not comparable in some situations. Like a colleague of mine said it really nicely. It said, if it's a claim about the natural world, we can actually test it. It's that simple. If it's not a claim about the natural world, I would say, who cares? But the question is how we act. That I care about, So
I think certainly in cases like that, where people actually make a choice, if you added it in, and instead of it being an alternative, it was complementary to the more scientific process, where we know it's not going to have a negative effect on you simply by doing it. The negative effect comes by the opportunity cost, as it were, of not doing something else. But no problem doing both. Why are we reducing our chances here? If there's two things that claim to fix something, well, if they don't necessarily interact in a negative way, why aren't we just doing everything? Again, this is zero. There's no negativity when you're looking at the light in the sky as the potential ending point. Let's take everything we can get at that stage. Throw it all at me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it all comes down to opportunity cost. So if it doesn't stop you from doing something else, great. But if it does stop you from doing something else, then you have to consider the opportunity cost. Yes, absolutely. So let's get to some meat and potatoes here. Like, what are some interesting superstitions that I mean, we're definitely going to talk about our own. I think, you know, it's going to be interesting for the listeners. But first, people like threw some interesting stuff around, like in the social media. Peter.
Yeah, so I had a good one from Jaywin, who is a member of the village, and also he's a popular YouTube vlogger and regularly appears on a lot of the big Texas poker streams. So people will know him from there. So if I just pull it up here, and Jay said, when he tosses in his bet and the chips bounce back to him, he knows he's winning that pot 100%. That's that's the sign. It's the money's coming back to him. So
that's right, and it's actually very interesting, because when I hear something like that, I mean, there's another correlational pattern, right? When something comes to us, more often than not, right? When something comes to you, what are the chances that that thing was not intended to come to you, right? So you know what I mean? If something comes to you, out of all the times that something has come to you, how many times have you kept it in the end, right? The vast majority, maybe, who knows, right? But the point here is that we're picking up that pattern. So when something's coming to us, it makes sense to say, oh, you know, instinctively, oh yeah, I mean, someone is giving it to us. I don't think that's irrational at all, by the way. I mean, you know, obviously it's incorrect, it's unsound, right? But it's not in sort of like invalid, all else being equal, it's not an invalid conclusion to make, to say, listen, most of the time that something comes to me stays with me. So, you know, if I close my eyes for a second and I don't look how it got to me, I have to assume that it's going to stay with me.
It's like when you're sitting at the poker table, you're all in with, you know, you're all in, you're 4% chance of winning two cards possibly in the whole deck to get you out, and you're calling for X card to come, and the card comes. And the idea that you calling for that card, which was in a physical deck in front of you, was set 5 minutes ago, that in any way changed because of what you were thinking and calling for and sending positive energy into the deck. Like, yeah, the causal effect is probably not it's probably very, very low. But
absolutely,
again, that, like, I mean, either you were getting that card or you weren't. But I think it sometimes gives us an even better sense when it actually comes off. It's almost like, oh my God, I did that. I was thinking of that card.
Absolutely.
And again, the negative ones too. Like, you know, I have seen Antonio Esfandiari do this previously on stream. Oh, what card? Oh, what's the thing? Don't think of the card. Okay, don't think of the king. Don't think of the king. Don't think of the king. Oh shit! I was talking about the king, and the king came. You know, like this. Like, how much of it is in jest and how much he actually believes is another thing. But again, the thought is there. These are little rituals that people have and things that go through their head that, again, have no real basis in. They've no basis in actually scientific fact. But the process, the logic in their mind is. Yeah, is sound. If I think about this card, that's what's going to come.
Yeah, I would say it doesn't have a basis on sound science. Like, it doesn't have a basis on good science. It does have a basis on rationality, which is the weird thing, right? Well, that's what I'm trying to say. It is a valid argument. It's just, like I said, it's misapplying the data. It's just, you know, making the conclusion makes sense, but we're starting from the wrong place. And the reason why we start from the wrong place is because accidentally there was a nudge in that direction. Like I said, you know, either something comes to us, so we think, oh yeah, more often than not, when something comes to us, we win. Or, you know, something horrible happened one time when we thought about the king, and the king came, so it was like, okay, maybe we shouldn't do that again. But there is a difference there between misapplication, if you will, of proper science, or misguidance, however you're going to call it, and irrationality. I think this is a very, very big distinction.
And then of course the you know, our the face of the brand, Mr. Wilson, had to come in with his own little, you know, and he said he's not superstitious, that he's only a little stitious. So
Indeed.
thanks for that one, Brad. That was a sound, meaningful contribution to today's debate. Well done. Thank you.
Great. So what are some of our own, Peter? Like, why don't you start? What are some?
So a long time ago, when GTO was something you drove and blockers still only played football, I used to play quite a lot of live poker and sometimes online. But if I was going to play live that night, I would not play online during the day for fear I used up all my run good. Because in my mind, I only had X amount of run good that day. And if I played online and happened to win, you know, some sit and goes or whatever I was playing at the time, well, that meant there was no way I was winning the tournament that I was entering that evening at the local card room.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's, you know, that's just the completely at odds with everything we know about variance, etc. However, it made sense to me at the time.
Absolutely. And let me just say, not only it makes sense, these are the type of things that, I mean, my students bring that stuff all the time, and I take it very seriously, right? I try to understand where this is coming from, because it's, like I said, it's easy to say, oh, are you an idiot? Like, why would you do that? But there's a very good reason. There's a very good reason. And here is, incidentally, I just want to say, before I say why there's a very good reason to say something like that, Patrick, also from the village, was saying something similar, you know, exactly the same thing. Like people are doing this, and there's a very good reason. It is essentially misapplication of the probability space, right? So in general, there's two different ways to assign probability space, and this is just fancy talk for all the possibilities out there. If I tell you, you know, let's use coins to keep it simple, right? I mean, let's say we flip a coin, and I tell you, flip a coin like 1,000 times. What kind of distribution, heads and tails, a fair coin, let's say, you're expecting to see? What sort of like distribution of like what kind of ratio heads to tails if you flip 1,000 coins?
It should be roughly even, but it's probably not going to be any more than a percentage either way.
That's right. No bats,
50,
though, right?
1/4.
Right. No bats at this point. You know, we're approaching it from first principles. You're absolutely right. It should be close to 50-50. So there is, right? There is a sometimes people call that convergence to the mean, you know, or going back to the mean. I forget the exact word that people are using in the markets right now, but it doesn't matter, right? That's correct. Like, this is the law of large numbers. That's actually a theorem that is actually absolutely correct. So if you start from coin 0 to a coin 1,000, you do expect to see a 50-50. But here's the interesting thing. Now, let's say that you flipped 600 of those coins and you have 400 coins left, right? Only 400 left. You've done the 600 have been flipped, and you have 400 coins to go. And during the flipping of the 600 coins, you saw something like 350 and 250 distribution, right? You saw a distribution, a 5-5, 7-5 distribution, right? So what do you expect the outcome to be when you're done with the remaining 400 coins? So far, let's say the heads are winning by 100. So what do you expect to happen after you're done with the 400 coins?
Yeah, if you were to follow on from what you have actually seen, you would think that, yeah, the greater number is going to just, that ratio is probably going to continue onward, and you're probably going to end up with something around 650 to 350 or 700 to 300 if that was to naturally follow.
You know what the funny thing is? Actually, that's the correct statistical thinking, actually. Funny enough, this is actually the correct statistical thinking, because assuming that you don't know that the coin is fair, right? Because you're
Yes.
using actually information to make prediction for the future. That is actually the correct way a gambler should think, right? If you see already a 7-5 distribution on the first 600 coins, the remaining 400 coins should follow that distribution. But if you know ahead of time that the coin is fair, and you just sort of like got unlucky on the head side, then that 100 head start should not be diminished. It should stay there, because those 400, they're, you know, on average, they're going to be 200, 200. So you're going to see a 50-50 distribution there. So that lead, the heads will maintain. And
Yes.
the thing is that we have a contradiction in our heads either way. Either we have to say, no, the tails have to catch up, in which case we're like, which one is it? If I just forget about the 600 and only concentrate on the 400, which one is it? The tails are catching up. But then if I do a different experiment where I start from 0 to 400, then the tails do not catch up. That's a contradiction also. Or we have to, you know, think in ourselves, oh, you know what? But I mean, how about the reversion to the mean? You know, like I have to deal with that, right? But the reversion to the mean is from the starting point. It's not from all the information you have so far. This is called conditional probabilities, and it's a very formally defined in mathematics. But there is a very deep reason, like a super deep reason, why we're having this superstition. You know, this is sort of like a pet peeve of mine. It's very serious to take it seriously. We can't just say, oh, come on, are you stupid? Everything is independent. Actually, I go in great lengths in the book to say that the person who says everything is independent is not the smartest person in the room, because they're not taking into account prior evidence. Right. And you said that, actually. You said, well, you know, it would seem if we see a 7-5 ratio, we have to take that evidence into account. Right. And that's the correct.
You can only use the data point. You can only go with the data points you have in front of you. And as you say, if you haven't been told that it's a fair coin, that's all you can use to make your assumptions.
That's exactly right. So I do think that this is a very, like, I don't know, like I take these things seriously, right? Because again, they show up all the time, and understanding that confusion, understanding where it's coming from, instead of dismissing it and saying, oh, this is something stupid. Come on, how could you not know? You know, I mean, who are we? Like, how did we know? And why are we so certain? What is the point? And why is that person missing it? You know, and we're not. Are we somehow better than them? I mean, come on. Like, who really like thinks comfortable with that idea? Why, you know, are we better? In what way? We're all human here. Try to figure it out. I don't like that theory. You know, like, you know, it's very elitist and very nonsensical to me. So,
and I think just to sort of add, especially when you're dealing with things like, you know, like these sort of 50-50 situations, sample size is always the key. The smaller the sample size, the bigger the likelihood of a skew in the data, as you say, a divergence from the mean, if you will. You know, you're gonna find, if you flip it 10 times, you could easily see 10 heads.
That's right.
You know, bigger numbers, bigger sample is always better when you're reviewing this stuff from a data collection point of view. And obviously, like 50-50 shots are the most basic, but like, I mean, it applies in every situation, especially in poker.
That's right. Yeah, that's the law of large numbers, right? I mean, essentially the variance goes to zero. I mean, you can prove it mathematically. That means that you do it long enough, you can get the expected outcome. So expectation stays the same, but variance is being reduced as the sample increases.
Yeah, like we get that a lot using like the data analysis stuff when we're reviewing. Like, we'll be looking at a spot and it'll come up with a, you know, we'll have a strategy based off that, but there'll be a proviso that, okay, the sample was quite small there. You know, we used a very small sample, so we'll be keeping an eye on that because we don't necessarily have a confidence in it. Whereas something else, we've got thousands of examples of that. That's, you know, that's much more likely to be sound. But the other, we have to be careful. The data collection is small on that one. So
absolutely,
all about sample size.
Sample size is very, very important, but do you know how long it took for people to realize that sample size matters? Right.
Probably a long time.
A long time. So we can't really be mad at people not understanding the and actually, how many people do you think they can actually prove the law of large numbers? It's actually not easy to prove. I mean, if you're a mathematician, it's fairly easy. But if if you don't have the formal training, how do you prove something like that?
I would not. I wouldn't know where to. I wouldn't even know where to start.
But my point is, it's not exactly something we're wired to understand. So if people have trouble with the law of large numbers, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's not an obvious, like the fact that the sample has to be greater, it's not trivial, it's not obvious. So misapplying that idea and just looking at a sample of one that we bought that jersey and our team won, therefore the jersey might be like, makes sense. Makes sense. It's rational based modulo, if you win, the information we have at this point, under our understanding of how things work. And it's important to understand that so that we can grow, right? I mean, otherwise, if everybody's trying to convince us that we're idiots just because we think that way, then we may give up on math entirely because, hey, I don't understand math, right? But in actuality, it's something that the entire humanity didn't understand until they did, with the revolution of statistics, which happened very recently, like a couple hundred years ago, pretty much, essentially. So we should, take all these things with a grain of salt, especially, like keep your, flaming. Be polite to people. These are not exactly easy things to deal with.
So Duncan, what are some of your superstitions, or do you have any superstitions or little rituals maybe that fall into that category that you'd like to share with the listener?
Absolutely. Again, I mean, my approach to superstitions in general, mine is a little bit different. Like I'll give you an example of what I do, and I'm actually fairly comfortable with this. I try to avoid hubris. And by that, I mean, it feels horrible to me to how sometimes life slaps you in the face and then sometimes slaps you in the balls, sometimes both of them, sometimes it slaps your face in the balls,
all at once.
All at once, right? So I don't like a situation where, I'm going to say something with confidence, like let's say trash talk somebody, and then all of a sudden they beat my ass, right? I hate that. Like there's no worse feeling than that. So for example, I like to avoid hubris. So let's say that instead of saying I'll see you in 2 years, I will say something, if all goes well, I'll see you in 2 years. That's not to sound smart, but in some sense, I do not want to provoke the universe, but again, it's like, that's how you could explain it to somebody. But, if I really think about it, it's really, I'm trying to avoid that feeling of being, slapped in various parts of my body.
The idea by making a sort of something more definitive statement, we're tempting fate. We're tempting fate, which I think is a concept that I think people are very familiar with. You don't, this is in the bag, touch wood. They'll make the statement and then they'll knock on wood to sort of, please, let's leave it like that. Don't knock me off course here.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think I try to the best of my abilities, I try to act, as meta humility being a real thing, trying to avoid hubris if possible. And of course, somebody will say, well, Duncan doesn't change anything. If you say, I'll see you in 2 years, I mean, you still have the same chance of dying and not making it in 2 years. Right. And I totally understand that. But from a practical standpoint, again, all that matters is how you act, not how you think. I want to avoid myself from being in a situation of actually being wrong about something and then being incredibly overly confident, and then it hurts, 10 times as much.
Just to I was looking, and poor Renee actually in the village also actually had an interesting one, and it was kind of, I think this is more one he kind of gave up. And Renee told us that he had he had a bracelet he bought for playing live, because people are sort of always looking at your hands. Right. He said he wore it, lost 6 buy-ins over the course of 2 sessions, and threw it out the car window on the way home. So it was the a negative causational factor that
Right.
poor Rene was applying to his much maligned bracelet, which is now gathering dust somewhere on a Texas highway.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's sort of like, again, like it matches the things that we're talking about. It gives a sense of control. And again, not to psychoanalyze Rene, of course, but it's interesting since we're talking about that topic.
We don't have that much time, to be fair now.
Oh, Rene, shout out to
Rene.
Rene.
We could be here for a while.
Okay, you're officially invited, to speak your own piece. Like, just consider this the official invitation to speak your mind. But yeah, I mean, it's getting control over the situation. It's low cost. Blow off steam, all of these things. So it's very proto-rational. It's not rational, but it's not irrational either. Like, I mean, there are correlational patterns. It's just that correlation does not imply causation. And it's very difficult for us, for our minds, to feel that way. We see correlation as causation. That's how we feel. That's why we have such big issue with noise and variance and things like that. So that's why we get fooled by randomness, because we see patterns where none exist. So we pick up correlations. And I hope I've stressed that enough, because this is actually a point that I disagree with Taleb. His version is that, people do irrational things because survivability precedes rationality, and that's his argument. But I think that what we do for survivability really also comes from rationality, proto-rationality, or weakly defined rationality, or weakly polished. That would be a good word. Weakly polished rationality.
And it's actually a form of which, like, based off last week's topic of sort of fancy play syndrome, they're kind of linked, because it's almost a need to add complexity to something that can be explained in a far more straightforward manner, as it were. There's always, for anything happening, there's usually, a very, straightforward reason. But if you were start introducing the idea that, a random act or something you did, brought about that particular action, you're adding a layer of complexity to it, where really it's not needed. But it's like that in a lot of cases. It's just a bit of fun, and it gives us something kind of to hang on to when we don't really have control. It gives us that sense of control in a world of chaos at times.
That's right. And that's a big part, and psychologists list that as the number one reason why people are superstitious. And by the way, we reached to the point where we have we promised the listeners we're going to have some really good questions that came from you guys. And for future reference, we'll talk about that. Go to the village, go to the Twitters of the world, post the questions, because we're going to be reading it. And the best question gets bragging rights too. So we have a really nice question by Decoy at AC Decoy on Twitter, and basically asks the following: if luck is the perception that the outer limits of probability being more improbable than they are, then is superstition related in impacting that perception, or does it have no impact at all? Right? So in other words, is the superstition affecting our perception of things around us? And I think we sort of like touched upon this, and we answered it already, right? I mean, it's all about that sense of control. Absolutely it does, right? I mean, we want to think that luck is either more important or less important, depending on whether it's against us or in our favors or whatever it is. So superstitions often fill a space which we do not fully understand, and thus we're vulnerable to. So in order to gain back control, it is fair to say that it has a great impact in that regard, right? So
yeah, absolutely, because like there are always, especially with things like luck, and there are always outliers. Like the example I gave earlier about the 2 outer on the river that you were thinking of, and all of a sudden the card came. Like, how many times did you sit there calling for that card and it never came? Right. But you don't and it comes back to recency, but you don't remember those times. You'll only remember the time that it worked. You forget about the 45 or 50 other times that it didn't work for you. So there are always those outliers sort of prove that you can use to sort of prove your logic is sound, even if it's, you know, coming from an unsound basis.
That's correct. And that's why we called it misapplication of data collection, right? I mean, we do cherry picking, we do all sorts of biases, but regardless, you know, that doesn't mean we're not rational. We're just
exactly we're not crazy people. We're not. That's right. We're not nuts. Let's be clear.
Speak for yourself, Peter. I've lost my mind. So what I would argue, just to excellent question, by the way, by Decoy. What I would argue is that we're still using our pattern recognizing devices to pick the best candidate available. But the issue is that we often force a pick, exactly what you basically said, even if such pattern does not exist. We're essentially fooled by randomness, right? I mean, we try to create a pattern where none exists, but the whole point is we really are trying to affect the perception, which is why, incidentally, you know, I mentioned earlier, and this is scientifically proven, that both rituals and faith can potentially have a positive impact because they're actions. Who cares what people think? What matters is how they act, right? And how they act can actually make or break their entire lives. And incidentally, that sort of like brings us to the final question, which is an amazing question. I think it takes the cake. But before we go there, was there anything else you wanted to add in the previous question, Peter?
No, I think because I think as you said, we had covered. I think we had kind of covered a lot of the around the basis for that question in what we had said up to that point. So yeah, no, happy to hear this next one.
So the next one comes from the Spiel at Spiel blog. And the question is apparently was asked also in Maria Konikova's book, and it was essentially asked by Eric Seidel at some point, and it goes something like this: can one engage in a superstition-adjacent ritual, for example, using a lucky charm, say, without believing it in a way that hurts, or I will add, helps one's mindset, right? So basically the question is, can you be involved in a ritual without creating any change in your, you know, psyche, so to speak? Can you be unscathed by a ritual that you don't believe in? And for anybody who's listening so far, I think you know what I'm going to say, right? I mean, for anybody who's listening, I mean, you know, if the premise that it doesn't matter what you think, all that matters is how you act, that's, if you are in that ritual, you're acting in it, right? So that action can have all sorts of repercussions. Now, here's the thing. Like I said, it matters how you act. If you're there in the ritual and the whole time you're on your phone, your action is you're completely detached from the ritual. If you are on the ritual and you really are trying to hit on that, you know, cute girl that sits on the side, once again, you're not really in the ritual. But if you're really in the ritual, I would argue, because you're acting, that could have very, very important consequences. And one thing that I realized by reading this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful question, I realized that's exactly what happens in poker, right? If you think about it, right? This is why poker, it's a game of skill. It's not about reading minds. It's not about trying to figure out what the opponent has. It never was. It's about how they act. It's about dissecting their actions. It really isn't. Who cares what they have? Like when somebody, like, let me give you an example, right? I mean, somebody will say, you know what? Oh, Duncan, I know you have it, but I have to call you. No, you don't. I'll have to call you. And he calls me, and of course, you know, like I have it. And then he's like, oh, you know, I knew it. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. You acted as if I don't have it. And no matter what you say, I could care less. And this is why I often say, and I make a big point of that in the book as well, that sometimes professional poker players who know, you know, the game, sometimes more often than not, they know how the recreationals play better than the recreationals themselves. Right? Because again, it's all about all the pattern recognition. And that's also why, I know, again, I've been talking for 11 million minutes by now, but that's why if you remove showdown from the game of poker, winning players will still be winning players, right? And this is why poker players, winning poker players, cannot be bluffed. And I mean that in a technical sense. What do I mean by that cannot be bluffed? I'm not saying that they cannot call with worse hands. We call with worse hands all the time. But if you call on the river and the opponent has a better hand, either your range beat the range, in which case you beat them, or the range was better than yours, in which where you lost your entire range. Either way, you were not bluffed. You lost by the range or you beat the range. There's no bluffing involved in that situation. When people are saying, oh, I bluffed you, if you're reacting in any way, which is, again, I understand why anybody would react, but ultimately, there is a lack of misunderstanding of how the game works. People cannot bluff you. It's impossible. Also, it doesn't matter what they're holding either, because you're not targeting their specific hand, you're targeting their actions. So if your response to their actions was sound, in other words, you was rational, if you will, I should probably say valid or sound, then you don't have to worry about anything. You know, you did what you're supposed to do. You acted based on information that you had available.
Yeah, which again makes a lot of sense. You know, and that kind of comes back to, and I'm assuming by just to clarify this one, this is as much for me as it is for the listener, what you mean in that situation. So their action. So let's say they place a pot-size bet on the river,
right? And
your appropriate action is to call at the correct frequency with that top portion of your range, 30% to break even. Is that what you mean by that, Duncan? Just to clarify,
whatever it may be. And again, but in actuality, you're not going to have a 30% call, right? In actuality, you're either going to call or you don't. I mean, of course, you can randomize and do all those things, but that's exactly my point. That's exactly my point. If you end up, you know, let's say you do your randomizer, right, and then you end up folding or you end up calling. It doesn't matter what they have, because your action has been determined based on what you saw so far. So the hand that they have is only relevant as evidence, as a data point for future construction of the ranges. It's completely irrelevant for the present hand. It doesn't matter. They cannot bluff you. They don't have a hand. This is one of the things that, you know, I tell my students to this day. People just, you know, like they have an issue with that. What do you mean? But they have a hand. They play based on that hand. Yes, but it doesn't matter what they have. What matters is how they act. That's what you try to deconstruct. That's what you try to decipher. Their holding is irrelevant. And of course, what you just mentioned right now, like if we talk about frequencies, like if you want to decide to call with, let's say, 30% frequency, like,
well, actually, sorry, Duncan, just for clarification, I meant we have to call 30% of the time, so we're going to call with the top 30% of our range.
I see.
As opposed to the free. Sorry, just to clarify that. So the top 30% of hands that we get there on the river.
Absolutely, but even with the excellent. But even with the alternative, you know, let's say that we're randomizing, which is both of them are fine. Like, you know, you say we want to call top 30% of your range, or even with this specific holding, you have to call 30% of the time. Both of these situations, the hand is only a teeny tiny piece of an entire picture. There's no bluffing involved, even if we call with the worst of it and we lose. Either our entire range is worse than them, in which case they owned us from before even the game started, or we made the right decisions, you know. So there's no bluffing involved at all, right? And I think this is something that is very difficult for us to grasp, and that's why poker is a complicated game. And I say that with a great amount of respect, and you know, and I take all of these concerns seriously. But I think really that question, this beautiful question by the Spiel, like, you know, talking about can your mindset be affected if you're in a ritual? Actions is all there is. We are our actions. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, that's essentially poker players know that
we can't separate ourselves. You cannot separate yourself from your actions. Your actions are there. Your actions tell the story greater than anything else will. What you do is that's because who you are. Like intent is in the background. What you actually physically do or say, your action in the moment, that is who you are. That is what you're saying to the world.
Absolutely. I do think this is relevant, and not to get not to get too dark here, but one of my favorite quotes, there is it's not the quote, it's like a sociologist often asks their students. He said, what do you think of slavery? Like, raise your hand if you are against it. And then, of course, I mean, the entire class will raise their hands. Of course, we're against slavery. So you're telling me, for example, okay, so let's say we go back to ancient Greece, where slavery was prevalent, or like ancient the Roman Empire, or the vast majority of the human history where slavery was the norm, and you live there. Are you going to be raise your hand if you're going to be a slaver? Nobody raises their hand. It's like, seriously, you're telling me, that's that, people, we think, that's essentially the super ego but any rational individual will of Sigmund Freud. It was about the super ego that Sigmund Freud was talking about. But any rational individual will know there is no way, all of us, would have avoided to be, sort of,
especially
like,
when we consider how massive a part of economies it actually was many times throughout history. Not wanting to drag us off, but like to actually say that, yeah, I wouldn't have been, it's actually ridiculous. So you were going to volunteer to probably be poor because
that's right.
There was so much rided on actually having slaves to operate businesses and stuff. So
that's right.
Yeah, no.
And so that's, I mean, it's obviously an extreme example, right? And it's an uncomfortable thought. It's not like, I mean, most people, myself included, we get a little bit of like, an upset stomach, thinking, because it's a horrible situation. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter what we think. Like, all that matters is how we act. So, when people are pressed for food or in extreme circumstances, and we see that also at the poker table, I don't care if you preach positivity. If you're an asshole at the poker table, you are an asshole in everyday life. It's very simple. It's as simple as that, right? So, and that's why I like poker so much, because we get to see the real people over there, right? When things are getting stressful.
Yeah, but it comes back like the old one, and I think like probably so many we've heard this in movies and stuff, especially war films. There's no atheists in foxholes. Because everyone, in the foxhole during the war.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yes.
Everyone's praying. Whether if they may have been sitting back at the barracks saying they were an atheist, when you're in that foxhole, everyone's praying. And there's again, by the action of praying, you're no longer an atheist. That's it. Doesn't matter. Your actions say otherwise.
That's, right. That's exactly right. Exactly correct. And it's interesting. It's we can also see that relationship, and also we can see the power of the action itself. That pray, right? I mean, makes you feel better and has all of these scientifically proven circumstances. Although for the, I think, atheistically minded, I should preface here, and I should be very careful about this. Not everybody is as comfortable in doing those rituals, and that's also very, very important. So that has been one of my long time critiques, one of the biases of religions, right? I mean, so I've been quoted in saying that, I don't know what the word God means, so I have no idea. But if that thing made sense, it was understood. I mean, somebody can explain it to me. I'm too dumb to understand what a God is. But in any case, if somebody could explain it to me, there would still be three very important problems. One of them would be the relativity, right? Different people are stuck because they were born in their own country. So let's say that one of these religious things is correct. I mean, I'm the unlucky one. I was born in their own country. That I call the regional bias. The other thing is the moral bias. Why light over darkness? That's why do we have that? And there's another bias, the personality bias. There's certain people who just don't feel comfortable with, like, essentially shutting off their brains and basically taking the easy way out. And so for those people, some of these rituals, they might not be comfortable. So again, just to be fair, because we found all the positive things of the rituals of religion. One of the negative things is that it specifically frames the mind in such a way that certain personalities feel incredibly uncomfortable being in that situation, because it closes, instead of like reducing the anxiety, which is the whole purpose, like instead of like feeding them answers, which some people want, it actually prevents them from explore further and find their own answers, or at least let the evidence point them in some direction. Certain people feel more comfortable in uncertainty than others. And I think this is relevant here.
Yeah, and it is, and I do think it's important to say that, and that may be tricky for possibly a lot of our listeners, but it's hard to comprehend how someone feels in that situation when you're not in that situation. Right. Like it seems like even I'm listening to it and I'm trying to, I have no comprehension what that feels like, but I can respect it. Right. I can say that's perfectly okay to be, but I have absolutely no idea how that feels. Now you could ask me something else and I could say, yeah, I totally know how that, but it's almost alien to me. And I'm sure that's how a lot of people feel about it. But to others, it's not. That's their norm. That's perfectly okay.
You know what you just did, Peter? You very eloquently summarized meta-humility.
Yeah.
You can never be in the other person's shoes, which is why it is so incredibly important to understand where they're coming from, and why, you often hear me not taking sides, talking about one side and then the same breath I take the other side. And I'm just like, the different people think differently. There's no universally accepted diet. There's no universally approach to ontological questions, right? That is not to say that all of the answers are of equal probability, if you will. There are certain answers which tend to work for many people. For example, religion is the answer to the vast majority of the people in the world. And that matters. It says something, right? So not all answers are created equal, but we can't have one size fits all. Which is the great thing about humanity, because we get to sit here and we get to have these debates and these kind of discussions. Right. If it was all the same, there'd be nothing for us to talk about, Duncan. That's exactly right.
We'd just be sitting here going over our bad beat stories and doing a poor man's version of Tactical Tuesday or something.
That's exactly. Speaking of bad beats, did I tell you the terrible bad beat that I had? I'm just kidding.
No, you didn't. I was just about to call it. I was just going to apologize to the listeners, give the answer to the question from the start of the show, and say goodbye. I wasn't even going to include you.
I love it. So where can people find us? So that they can post questions, we're gonna, and we know the topic for next week, right? I mean, we're talking poker and resilience, how poker brings resilience, and we're gonna bring the great Doc. She is an active member of the village, and she's gonna offer her insight. So where can people post some good questions about poker resilience?
So go to chasingpoker.com/greatness village. You can find it there. We have our own tab in the village, Philosophical Friday. Come in there and add all the questions you want. And remember, there are no stupid questions. You can find me on Twitter, Peter Bermingham, @PeterBermingham with a 4 at the end of it, on Twitter. Post questions at me there. Tag me in a question if you will. And then we have Duncan, who can be found at
Ask the Math DR on Twitter. And also, if you want to, instead of listen, you want to watch this podcast, see us get animated and excited about stuff. Why Alex?
We do. I use a lot of hand gestures and stuff like that. I definitely have more of a face for radio, but I get animated physically. So there you go.
We should, absolutely. So why Alex beats Bobby? We post a video there every Friday. And again, make sure you also vote for the best question, because we're going to be declaring a winner every week. And this week the winner is the Spiel. I absolutely love that question from Maria Konikova's book, and incidentally, I believe Eric Seidel, because he followed up with that. He said that observing any kind of lucky anything will distort one's thinking, and she agrees. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be distorted, but I would say that it matters. Actions matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so for the big reveal from our question from the start of the show, in case anyone had forgotten, which online poker player and streamer said that when they're on a downswing, they shave all their facial hair because they believe it gives them a fresh start and a chance to get back to winning ways. So that is the great Jeremiah Williams. Mr. Williams, being a very logical and sound player, never gets rattled at the tables. You watch him on stream there, bad beats all over the place, never, but still believes on a downswing he must shave his facial hair. So well done, Jeremiah. Thank you for providing that one to us. And
shout out.
Good luck with your challenge.
Absolutely, and shout out to Jeremiah. And I think with that, we will leave everybody. I'll talk to them to next week. Peter, thank you for another excellent podcast.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And we will see you all next week. Take care.
Take care, everybody.